new unit. It's on graphing. So what I'd like for you to do is open to this page. It's in your packet. And let's see. So we're going to be graphing using table of values. So one of the things I want to make sure is that regardless of what equation you have, creating a table of values will always work. When I do that, you're going to pick your x values. This is known as the independent variables. They do not rely on anything. And then you plug it into your rule. This is the rule. So for this one, it's y equals 2x plus 3. In other words, you take your x number, multiply it by 2, and then add 3 to get your y number. When I have chosen these, again, these are my x values and these are independent, but as you create your tables, you get to pick which x values. So what I do is, here's my x number, and I'm going to apply it to my rule, which is here, and it says y equals 2x. So every time I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 2, multiply it by 2, and then add 3. So 2 times 2 is 4, plus 3 is 7. Now this here are my coordinates. So then I would go over here and plot 2, 7. So then that would be here. That's right. 2, 7. And now I'm going to take my next x value. So every time I see an x, I'm going to replace it with a 2. And I think of it as this: 2 times my x value plus 3. And here I'm just doing it mentally. So now x is 0. 2 times 0 is 0, plus 3 is 3. So here's my next point: 0, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to plot that. My other value, I always want to pick some positive numbers and some negative numbers, and I always want to include 0 because that's so easy to calculate. So now I'm going to pick, now I have when x is -1. So every time I see my x, I replace it with a -1. Now this part here, you could just do in your head or write it on Chicken Scratch. I don't need to see that step. 2 times -1 is -2, plus 3 is 1. So I'm going to write this 1, and these are my coordinates. So I'm going to find -1 on my x-axis and 1 on my y-axis, and that'll be this point here, that point there. Now I'm going to do -2. So I'm going to replace -2 for my x value. And using my order of operations, I'm going to work it out. 2 times -2 is -4, plus 1 is a -1. So I'm going to go over here and find -2 on my x-axis, find -1 on my y-axis, and where they meet is my point. Now, what I want you to do is you're going to have to plot a minimum of 4 points, and I know this created a straight line, and it could go on forever. And I'm going to label my line to let it know what rule did this line follow to get those points. So that's really important. I need all of those steps. When you complete your table, you're going to plot your points. So here's my sidebar. You're going to plot your points and label your graph. When I talk about labeling my graph, not only the equation, but also my axes. This is my x number line, and here's my y number line known as the axes. Now, when I'm graphing things, notice that this is a straight line. So we would refer to this as a linear equation. So we want you to write linear. I also want you to notice my equation has an x and a y. So it crosses my x-axis and it also crosses my y-axis. So that's going to be a key piece here. Now, looking at this one, and I also want to point out which direction my graph leans. It leans to the right, so we would refer to this as a positive equation. So this is positive since it's leaning to the right. It leans to the right, so it is positive. As I go left to right, that's how I see it. Now let's look at this one. So here I have y equals x minus 2. It has an y and an x, so I know it's going to go through my x-axis, and it will also go through my y-axis, okay? And when I have y equals x minus 2, that means take my x number and subtract 2. Notice I don't have any x values. These are independent. So I get to choose. So I'm going to pick 0, some positives, and some negatives. And I'm going to put -3. Okay? And I'm going to plug that in. So in my mind, I think, okay, to get my y answer, I'm going to take my x and subtract 2. So I'm going to replace this x with a set of parentheses to remind me that's what I'm plugging in. So every time I see a x, darn it, -2. So my first one is 0, so I'm going to plug in a 0 in there. And 0 minus 2 is -2. Now I'm going to go over here and plot it. 0 on the x-axis, it's 0, -2. That be this point here. Now I'm going to plug in 1 into my equation. So I have 1 minus 2 is -1. So I'm going to go over here and I get 1 and -1. That's this point here. Now I'm going to take 2 and plug it in. So it says take my x number and subtract 2. Well, that gives me a 0. So I'm going to go 2, 0. Now I have -1. So I'm going to replace x with this -1. Minus 2 is -3. And I'm going to plot that. So -1, -3 is here. And then now I'm going to try -3. So -3 minus 2, so that's a -3 minus 2 gives me a -5. Signs are the same, I add. So -3, -5 would be right there. Notice again, this is a straight line. We call that linear. So I'm going to write that this is a linear equation. It also leans to the right. When I think of it like a ladder, it leans to the right. So we call that positive. It's going in the positive direction or going up. Think of it that way. And we'll address more of this positive, negative later. So I'm just getting used to that notion. And what else do I have? And I need to label my rule that it used. It used y equals x minus 2. This is my y-axis, and here's my x-axis. Okay, next one. So here I have y equals -3x. So it takes multiply by -3 to get my y answer. So I'm going to start with 0. 0 times -3 is 0, so that goes right here. Also, there's a y and an x, so it'll go through my x-axis. It's also going to go through my y-axis. Now let's pick, I want to know what's going on further over here. I'm going to pick 4. Will it fit? No, I'm going to pick 3. It won't fit. I'm going to pick 2. Sorry. 2 times -3 is a -6. So here's 2, and it's -6. That goes there. And I want to know what's going on when it's negative. So I'm going to pick -3. And 3, that's too big of a number. I can't fit it in my graph, so I'm going to choose -2 instead. So again, 3 times -2. Again, I think of it this way. I'm putting -2 in there. And I get a positive 6. -2 gives me a positive 6, so that's this one. Oh, let's see, we've tried 0. Let's do -1 and 1. Okay. And this will give me a 3, because a negative times a negative is a positive. 1, 3, whoa. -1, 3, I was graphing that wrong. And 1 times a -3 is a -3. And notice again, a nice clean straight line. If I did any of the math part, it would have been all cattywampus because so I know this is linear. So I'm going to indicate that it's a linear equation. And I'm going to write y equals -3x, label my axes, and now I'm done. Okay, so I'll be looking for those pieces. So now I have here, my next one is have y, to get my y number, that's these here. I have to take half of my x number, multiply it by a negative, and add 4. Or you could say multiply by a negative 1/2 and add 4. Since I'm multiplying by a negative 1/2, I'm going to pick x values that are divisible by 2. So I'm going to pick 0 is always easy to do. I'm going to pick 2 and a negative 2, and then I want to see what's going on over here. So half of 0 is 0 plus 4 is 4. Half of 2 is 1. And again, if you're not sure how I'm getting that, I'm going to put, every time I see that x, I'm going to replace it with my number. Half of 2 is 1 times a negative. That gives me negative 1 plus 4 gives me 3. Now it's a negative 2. Half of 2 is 1. Negative times a negative is 1. Plus 4, that gives me 5. I'm trying to, okay. And now I'm going to figure out my 4. I place in 4. Half of 4 is negative 2 because of that negative. Plus 4 gives me 2. Now I'm going to plot them. 0, 4, 2, 3. These again, these are coordinates. That's how you want to think of it. 2, 3 is here. Negative 2, 5, negative 2, 5, and 4, 2. So again, nice clean straight line. It's going down, so that's how I see this is going down. So it's kind of like a negative line. So I'm going to write that line there, make it go through all my points. And it's going to, and I'm going to write what rule it used. So it used y equals negative 1/2 x plus 4. And here's my y-axis. There's my x. It had an x and a y, so I knew it's going to cross through my x-axis. It's going to cross through my y-axis. So it's real important that you recognize that pattern as we get to graph others. And this is linear. Okay, let's see. Now let's look at this one. Notice this one has y equals negative 3. There is no x value at all. So I know it's only going to cross my y-axis. So let's highlight that y-axis. It's really important. So this means all my y's are 3. That's what this rule says, or negative 3. So I'm going to write this as negative 3. Now on my sidebar, it says graphing equations with only one variable. So really pay attention to this. We highlighted our y-axis because it only has a y, and we'll get to the sidebar notes in a minute. So if all my y's are 3, x could be anything. 0, negative 1, 2, 4. Now I'm going to plot them. 0, negative 3. Oh, goodness. 0, negative 3. Come on. Aren't you grabbing? Or did you die? There he is. 0, negative 3. And he doesn't want to work. You're weird. I'll use my finger. 0, negative 3. And now I'm going to graph negative 1, negative 3. Negative 1, negative 3 is also here. 2, negative 3. It's 2 on the x-axis and negative 3 on my y-axis. It's weird that it doesn't want to graph. My battery's dying. There we go. 2, negative 3, I apologize. And the 4, negative 3, that's over here. Notice that this is also linear. It's nice and flat. Okay, that's my equation of a line. And I'm going to write y equals negative 3. Notice it just crosses the y-axis because there's only the variable y. So that's one way to remember that. Okay, now let's graph the next one. I have y equals 5. That means all my y's are 5. All my y's are 5. Okay, so I'm going to make them all 5. I'm going to graph them on the same one. So that means these, I could pick anything. I'm going to pick negative 2, negative 3. How about 4? Oh, I do the same. So I'm going to plot 0, 5. negative 2, 5, negative 3, 5, 4, 5, and again, I get my horizontal. And notice it does not cross the x-axis. Okay, this is called horizontal. Y equals 5. These are all horizontal. They're still linear, so we're still going to write linear. They're still linear. And so when I have it horizontal, there's no x in the equation. So let's write no x in the equation. Okay. And they look like this. That's horizontal. Think of the horizon. It does not cross the y-axis. The x-axis does not cross. Since there is no x, there will not cross the x-axis. It's real important that you recognize that. It only crosses the y-axis. Okay, and I'm going to take my highlighter and it only crosses the y-axis. Okay, that's my y equals. Those are my y equals some number. Okay, then, so what if I have nothing but an x-axis? An x. So I have x is equal to, so I want you to highlight the x. Notice there's no other variable. So I'm going to highlight my x-axis. And this one says all my x's are negative 2. So I'm going to make it a little bigger. So now on the x-axis, x column, they're all negative 2. That's what that means. And y could be anything. It has no rule to it. Negative 2, 3, negative 1. Okay, now I'm going to plot that one. So these are my x equals. There are no y, so it will not cross the y-axis. So at negative 2, 0 is here. Negative 2, 5 is here. Negative 2, 2 is here. Negative 2 and 3. So I'm plotting these points here. Negative 2 and 3. Negative 2 and 1. Negative 1. So that one is what we call a vertical line. So this is vertical. These are vertical equations. And again, it's also linear. It's still a straight line. But notice it does not cross the y-axis. They do not cross. Okay, so those do not cross the y-axis. So on the vertical, those are my x equals some number. If you want to put like 5, there is no y. Notice there is no y in the equation. No y. Okay, highlight that x. Oopsie. Highlight the x. And it does not cross the y-axis. It only crosses the x-axis. The ones that have an x and a y, notice that they were kind of slanted. They just slant differently. So he slants to the right, so we call them. So these cross both axes, so they will be slanted. Okay, they will always be slanted since they have an x and a y. Okay, versus these are not slanted. It's either up and down or horizontal. Okay. Okay, so let's look at this one. This one I have y equals x squared minus 2. So it says take your x number, square it, and then subtract 2 to get your y. So I'm going to pick 0, and then I'm going to pick 1. I'm only going to do a few, and then see where my graph takes me. So 0 squared, again, I think of it as, 0 squared minus 2 is negative 2. So I'm going to plot 0, negative 2. 1 squared is 1 minus 2 is negative 1. So 1, negative 1. Now what's unique about this one? This one has a square. We're going to see what happens when I have a square in my equation, also known as a function. Now I'm going to go to, so I'm going to find out what's going on. What about 2? 2 squared is 4, minus 2 is 2. 2 squared, it's up here. Notice it's no longer a straight line, it's starting to curve. Well, let's see what's going on with, what about when it's 3? Well, actually, I want to know what's going on the other side. Let's do -2. Instead of 3, let's do a -2. -2 squared is 4, because it's -2 times -2. -2 is 2, so -2, and that's there. So if I'm not sure, I'm going to add more points to get a real clear picture of what I have. I'm going to do -1 also. So -1, I'm going to put -1 in here. Squared is 1, minus 2 is -1. That's here. What's going on? So let's look at 3. What if I do 3? 3 squared is 9, minus 2 is 8. 3 squared is right up here, and over this graph would be, if I were to get -3, I would also get a 9, an 8. This is what we call a parabola. This is something that is non-linear. It curves. Notice it has that squared. Any exponents will give me some kind of curve. Okay, it has an x and a y, so I know it will cross my x-axis and it'll cross my y-axis, but it's also non-linear. That means it's not a straight line. Okay, so it's really important then when we're graphing that you recognize if it's linear or not, complete your table of values, and then we're going to write our equations. Y equals x squared minus 2. This is what we call a parabola. We'll see those in the second trimester. Okay. Now, what if I'm asked to graph but they're not the y equals? So I have to write in the y equals blah, blah, blah. So I have to solve for y. So I'm going to circle that, draw my y, my line. I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. And I get -3y equals -2x plus 6. And now I'm going to divide by a -3. Since I have two terms here, I'm going to divide by -3 on both sides. So now I have y equals 2/3 x minus 2. Now I can make my t-table and plot my points. Here I'm going to solve for y, so I'm going to add 4x to both sides. I get -2y equals, these are not like terms, so I'm going to write 4x plus 12. Divide by a -2, there's 2 on these, so I'm going to divide this by a -2 and that by 2. And I get y equals, simplify, -2x minus 6. Now I could create my t-table, plug in my values to plot my points. And here, I'm going to skip this one, but I'm going to do this one because of that negative. So I'm going to subtract 6x from both sides, and I get a -y equals, and I'm going to put it in descending order, -6x minus 12. Now here I have a negative, so I'm going to divide everything by a -1. Since there's two terms, they get each divided, and I get y equals 6x plus 12. And now I can create my t-table.